ZoomerLife. Health, wellness, and longevity from the world's brightest minds.
It is ironic, isn't it, with all the information that's out there, and there's never been more, that there's also so much by way of perverting influences, which brings us to Dr. Mike Evans, and before I call him out here, watch this.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Evans, and welcome to this visual lecture I'm calling 23 and a half hours. So I have a big interest in preventive medicine, which can mean a lot of things from, cancer screening to eating more fiber to having a good social network, and I mean that in the old sense of the word. Weighing less, drinking less, smoking less, controlling your blood pressure, cholesterol, and so on and so forth. So all of these things are incredibly important, and I wouldn't want you to minimize your efforts in any one category, but I want to know what comes first. What has the biggest impact? What has the biggest return on investment? What makes the biggest difference to your health? So I did my research, and I found an answer, at least for me, and it's tricky because, all these things are sort of overlapping. But I picked out this intervention, and because of its breadth, it worked for so many different health problems, and that's what I found so cool about it. So just to kind of walk you through a quick list. So this intervention in patients with knee arthritis who receive 1 hour of treatment 3 times a week reduced their rates of pain and disability by 47%. In older patients, it reduced progression to dementia and Alzheimer's by around 50%. For patients at high risk of diabetes and coupled with other lifestyle interventions, it reduced progression to frank diabetes by 58%. Postmenopausal woman who had 4 hours a week of the treatment had a 41% reduction in the risk of hip fracture. It reduced anxiety by 48% in a big meta-analysis. Patients suffering from depression, 30% were relieved with low dose, and that bumped to 47% as we increased the dose. Following over 10,000 Harvard alumni for over 12 years, those that had the intervention had a 23% lower risk of death than those who didn't get the treatment. It's the number one treatment of fatigue, and of course, the kind of outcome of choice there, my favorite outcome is quality of life, which is really all of the above and really about making your life better. And this treatment has been shown over and over again to improve quality of life. So the question is, what's the medicine and what is 23 and a half hours? So the medicine was exercise, mostly walking, so not triathlons. And let me just put it a different way. I think what I'm asking you to do is, if you think about your typical day, so there's 24 hours, and so you might spend most of your day, this varies obviously, but couch surfing, sitting at work, obviously sleeping. And what the evidence that I'm going to show you kind of tells me is the best thing you can do for your health is to spend half an hour being active, maybe an hour, and that if you can do that, you can realize all the benefits I've described in the previous slides. So let's just take a quick walk through some of the literature. So Stephen Blair, he's a professor at the Arnold School of Public Health at the University of South Carolina, and he looked at this in what's called the Aerobic Center Longitudinal Study, which followed over 50,000 men and women over time. And along the left side of this graph is something called attributable fractions, which is a kind of fancy word, but it's the estimate of the number of deaths in a population that would have been avoided if that specific risk factor had been erased. So, for example, turning a smoker into a non-smoker or a couch potato into a daily walker. And along the bottom is the typical risk factors. You can see the hypertension is incredibly important and so on and so forth. But the one that kind of applied the most risk was this sort of mysterious CRF, which is cardiorespiratory fitness, which is really low fitness. So low fitness was the strongest predictor of death. And this is important that most of the trials we see, to be honest, are funded by pharma or other companies because they've got a drug for hypertension or high cholesterol or diabetes. And we rarely see fitness thrown into the mix. And so it's nice to see a trial that's not so siloed. Blair's work is interesting. He also did another trial looking at obesity. What he found was, sort of two things. One is obesity and no exercise. That's a very bad combination, and that's where we saw many of the negative consequences of obesity from a health point of view. But if the obese person was active, even if they didn't have the weight loss, but were just active and obese, that was much, much better, and that the exercise ameliorated much of the negative consequences of obesity. So if exercise is a medicine, what's a dose? So when I think of dose, I think of how long, how often, and how intense. I'm going to give you a slightly mixed message, but essentially more activity is better. But I must say the rate of return seems to decline after 20 or 30 minutes a day. So if you're being active less than 150 minutes a week, or more if you're a kid, an hour a day if you're a kid, my flag goes up in the clinic. So my personal take on this is that the literature draws a very broad brush, and so we see big differences when somebody goes from not doing anything to doing something, and after that the return is more granular. So if we took the Nurses' Health Study, women who went from zero activity to just 1 hour a week reduced their heart disease rates by almost half. So you can break it down, so it can be 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes if you want to do 30 minutes of exercise, so it can be broken into 3. Higher intensity, it looks like it's equivalent to less time with lower intensity. But I think obviously the clinical pearl is mostly thinking about your style and habits and your personal cues. So if you're only going to do it if it's pre-booked with friends, I have couples that take a half-hour walk every morning or evening to organize their life. A dog is a great walking coach. The data is showing 67% of dog walkers achieve the 150 minutes a week just with the dog walking. And finally, of course, your commute, getting off stop early, taking the stairs, and so on and so forth. So thinking about that, I'm just going to walk you through some quick slices of the literature. The first one comes from Japan. In the 90s, Japan required all employers to conduct annual health screenings for their employees. And so a large gas company in Japan called Osaka used this to answer a great question. So if people's walk to work was longer, did that reduce their chance of serious health problems? So in this example, high blood pressure. And what they found is under 10-minute walk, no difference. 11 to 20-minute walk, 12% reduction in rates of high blood pressure or hypertension. And over 21-minute walk, a 29% decrease in rates of high blood pressure. So the authors calculated that for every increase of 10 minutes in your walk to work, there was a 12% reduction in the likelihood of getting high blood pressure. The second exhibit is looking at stents. So this is something we commonly do down medicine. So you can see on the left here, the artery's blocked. On the right, a vascular surgeon's gone in and put in a balloon, opened it up, and left a stent to keep it open, which makes great sense. So a German researcher named Rainer Hambrecht looked at this with about 100 cardiac patients. He got half the group to exercise, and by that I mean 20 minutes a day on an exercise bicycle, and then once weekly 60-minute aerobics class. And the other half got the high-tech stent and just their sort of normal activity. And after 1 year, 88% of the exercises were event-free compared to 70% of the people that got a stent. So both worked, but I find it sort of incredible that the low tech made a bigger difference. And you have to remember that the stent just fixes one part of the heart. The next way to think about it is the reverse. So what I call sitting disease. We know that being sedentary is bad for your health, but a researcher named Leonard Veerman wanted to quantify this, and he did so down in Australia in a big study they did there. They found, compared with persons who watch no TV, those that spend a lifetime average of 6 hours a day watching TV can expect to live about 5 years left. I mean, that's incredible. But then I think, who watches 6 hours a day of TV? And it turns out the average adult in the USA spends about 5 hours a day watching TV or screens. So I find this fascinating that we never think of the TV as something that's bad for our health, but clearly it's as powerful as many other risk factors for chronic disease. So I'm just going to leave you with, I guess, two quotes. So one is Jerry Garcia, the singer who is the lead singer for the Grateful Dead. And he said, somebody has to do something. It's just incredibly pathetic that has to be us. And I think that's true, that in some ways it has to be us. As Hippocrates said, walking is man's best medicine. And so I'm going to finish by asking you a question. And this may have some personal challenges for you. So, you might be very busy with work or kids or both, and you may be in pain or have other priorities. But my question to you is, can you limit your sitting and sleeping to just 23 and a half hours a day? So something to think about. Thank you very much.
I think it's highly unusual and very, very cool that Dr. Mike Evans has chosen to fuse his own work and the work of other clinicians with the so-called creatives, that is, the illustrators, designers, and filmmakers that make a video like that. And he does that because he says most people are visual learners. Dr. Mike Evans. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I just wanted to clarify right from the get-go, so that I had all the kids on my hockey team convinced that I was actually doing the drawing. And then, you know, on the web, there's all this sort of social interaction. So people going back and forth saying there, and the final analysis was there's no way a doctor could print that clearly. It can't be him. So thanks very much for having me. I'm going to talk about two what we call disruptive innovations. And so when we think of disruptive innovations, we think of sort of a technology coming in and totally changing the playing field. And so that's my first story. The second disruptive innovation is the opposite. It's low tech and maybe even anti-technology, and that's going to be more about you. So just a word before we get going. So as Moses said, I'm a physician. I'm an academic family physician. I practice St. Michael's Hospital here. I spent a lot of time, like many of you have in the past, driving kids to hockey. One of my kids plays for Wendell Clark, so I'm the water boy on the team. And then most of what I do now is, beyond seeing patients and teaching, is I run a lab. And, you know, most doctors run labs with microscopes and all that kind of stuff. But my lab brings together filmmakers, illustrators, social media people, business people, and we kind of crunch them together with the clinicians and researchers, and we make things. And we embed them in the clinic, we embed them in media, we hope to embed them in your homes and mobiles, and we kind of research that, what works, what doesn't. So, and I think, you know, a lot of my work is around sort of patient education, and you know, I think right now it's a great opportunity because basically when you go see your doctor, you walk out with this sort of 1970s pamphlet that didn't answer the questions that you actually have. And I think a lot of us say to ourselves, wow, that's not chicken. And I think a big part of that is because we give a kind of one-size-fits-all solution. So the person in the middle of this photograph is a kind of amalgamation of the people all around. And I think we create patient education resources for that person in the middle. But if you think about, you know, even if you just look at the four people on the bottom, they have totally different ways of knowing, different literacy levels, different cultures, different ways of understanding, and certainly different levers for change. And that's the big game in my office is change. And so we have to create much more of a custom solution. Buffet is probably the wrong word to use in healthcare, but I think we need to create a better buffet so that people can kind of pull down what works for them and what doesn't. So in my clinic, I spend a lot of time thinking, what is this viral or is this bacterial? This is me looking into my youngest son's mouth. It's actually funny, I was looking at this slide last night, and we both have lots of freckles. And I worked for Mother Teresa in Calcutta for quite a while in Calcutta, and I worked in their leprosarium. And there was guys there with no nose and no ears and missing half his fingers. And he came up and looked at my skin, and he goes, and looks at the freckles and looks at me with all the empathy in the world and goes, is it curable? And it just goes to show health is relative. You know, he was feeling like, oh, well, this guy has to go through his whole life with this stuff on his skin. So I told him in my country is a sign of great beauty, which I tell my son as well. But what we do in my design lab is we think, how can we make this more infectious? So not everything's going to go viral. A lot of it's bacterial. But how can we make it more infectious? How can we engage peer-to-peer healthcare? How can we get you to send it to your friend? And the way we do that, so a lot of us in medicine focus, we tell you the obvious. So avoid pouring on crotch area. Or en français, ne pourrez pas dans l'area de ouh la la. And I spent a lot of my life giving patients data. And what I've come to understand is that stories trump data. Relationships trump stories. So when you give something, you know, it could be me to a patient, but it could be a father to a son or a daughter to a mother or a friend to a friend. And I think in a lot of ways, individuals trump organizations. So we were in our lab, we're thinking, okay, what's the thing out there? And obviously one of the big things is YouTube. So if you looked at the three big American stations broadcasting 24/7 for the last 60 years, they still wouldn't have uploaded as much content that's uploaded on YouTube every 30 days. Like, it's this incredible machine. We sat in a lab and created what you saw. I had no idea. I had an illustrator who done a great job. So we put it online. I was at a hockey rink. We had 340 views in the first week, and then on the Friday we had 17,000 views. And now it's probably got about 4.7 million views, and we loaded it less than a year. Whenever I get kind of proud of it, there's JWoww here who highlights a certain part of her body in all her screenshots, and she's got like 10 $1 million views. So just when you think you're great, my brother goes, yeah, I clicked on JWoww before I clicked on you. But it really is incredible. So we've had, it's been shown in Scottish Parliament. It's been sent to every person in the Scottish government. We've had Fitness Chain that had 1 million people on their list, send it to all of them individually. It's been translated to 6 languages. It got translated to Arabic by a public health doctor in Riyadh, and it had almost 1 million views in a week. It was the 4th most watched thing in all of YouTube. And it took us about $150 to change the sound file. To hit that many people, it's just incredible. We've had lots of likes, some dislikes. 60,000 people have viewed it on their mobile phone in India. We've had about 800,000 people look at it on another website than ours. So people embed it on their website and share it to one another. We signed a deal with YouTube, and we've launched a YouTube medical school for the public. So I see patients one at a time. I started something called the Mini Med School, which is a med school for the public at U of T. And I used to brag that we get 400 people in there. Now I've got 160,000 viewers a month and growing every week. So I have more followers and more viewers than the Heart and Stroke, the Canadian Diabetes Association, and the Canadian Cancer Society all put together. And I had no followers a year ago. So that's a disruptive technology. That's changing the playing field incredibly. It's incredible. And we're starting to kind of build a bigger medical school, which is fun. So the next thing I'm going to talk to you about is another big disruptive innovation. And it's similar to what the first 2 presenters talked about, certainly similar to what Tim was talking about, because the low-tech health innovation is actually you. And it's a similar message. The theory is that we're all looking for that next big hit. We're looking for the new machine, the new workout, the new goji berry, the new superfood. And at the end of the day, I think it's all actually in you, and it's a slightly different angle than what Tim was talking about. So obviously the video is about moving, but it's a lot about your thinking and your attitude, your relationships, and your habits. So this is just one slide, and it's a different view than Tim's view, but definitely overlapping. So this is patients in the ACLS who were fit or unfit, not obese, obese. And you can see here, if you were obese and you were fit, your health outcomes were much better. You died less. So patients are coming into my office all the time in this sort of learned helplessness cycle of obesity. And I get the Vandy play. If you can lose weight, that's great. That will have health benefits. But if I was the Minister of Health, I'd be saying, I'm more interested in you being active. I'm more interested in you walking. Which is counter to what people talk about. And I think there has to be a culture change. So if you're like me, you're sort of searching around for that that parking spot that's like 20 feet closer, and you get it and you're like, yes! And I think they should have a parking at the back of the lot for people who want to live longer and have a higher quality of life. And it's a culture change. I think we need to make our life harder. I tore all my ankle ligaments in August, and I've walked around in a cast, and I got so tired. I was so inactive. So I started bicycling, and one of my friends took a picture of me as I was bicycling by with my cast, and then sent it to all my other friends saying, would you trust this man to be your doctor? So I think you have to sort of think about making your life harder. And so one of the things I want to think about, when we think about change, we think about the big New Year's resolution and a big change, and I'm going to lose all this weight. And I would actually have the opposite approach. I actually think it's about looking at your week and saying, hey, I'm drinking juice or pop. How can I substitute that with water? How can I add another 10 minutes walk to my day? How can I take the stairs? How can I park farther away? How can I get off a stop earlier? And thinking about tweaking your week. Because I think it's all about habits. So this is Michael Danzinger's study looking at randomized control trial done in 2005, looking at the Atkins versus the Zone versus Weight Watchers versus Ornish, which was a kind of healthy vegetarian diet in the US. So which one works better? Well, when they went head to head, as you can see, the answer is there wasn't a difference at all. The one thing that predicted a difference was however well you stuck to whichever diet you pick. The individual diets didn't make a difference. It was your habits that predicted differences. So people are coming in looking, oh, is this diet? Doesn't matter to me. You pick whatever diet you pick. Some are healthier than others, for sure. But if weight loss is your outcome, it's much more about your habit than the diet itself. Another look at that is the National Weight Control Registry. So over 10,000 members, they've kept off their weight for over a year, often a lot of weight, so on average 30 pounds, more women than men. What were their habits? Well, they ate breakfast. They limited their TV watching. They self-monitored. So Rena Wing, who's running these trials, did a stop-regain trial. The number one predictor of people who were able to keep off the weight was they weighed themselves frequently. Because when you're making your 100 food decisions a day and you were 2 pounds over that morning, you veer to the one way. They're able to, they'll accept the occasional derailment and kind of get back on track. They didn't have different rules for weekends or holidays. And they walked. So Tim's right, an hour of activity and you have a muffin and a fat latte. They're about equivalent. However, the people that are able to keep weight off tend to be active. So caloric-wise, it's a no-brainer. But the people who are active tend to be able to keep the weight loss off because it's all a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. The next thing I want to talk to you about is relationships. And I love this slide, and I shouldn't love it because it's about people dying. But when somebody dies, their partner has initially a 60% increase in risk of death, and then that drops down quite quickly over the month, and then it actually stays at 20%. And I love this trial because it's like these are the ties that bind. You know, we're so interdependent. And I see these incredibly cranky couples in my offices, and but they're interdependent. Two great styles. One the PATH study. And one the cable study, one looking at relationships and one looking at, well, when you're partnered up, does the quality of the partnership make a difference? And the bottom line was, if you're a man, having a partner is good, and having a higher quality relationship is better. If you're a woman, having a partner is a good thing mostly. However, a poor quality relationship, it's worse. So men seem to kind of trundle on despite the quality of the relationship. For women, it's quite deleterious on their health. There's a great study in Eastern Europe when they were sort of falling apart, and when women died, when women died, the quality of the men's life crash kind of thing. When women died, when the men died, the women's quality of life went up. But the thinking was that there was such a bad economy that they couldn't do it, but who knows. Friendships are clearly important. 11% of people have no friends. And you probably don't see those people that often, but I see them all the time in my clinic. And if I could write a prescription for loneliness, that would be great. But if you have a relationships, less than 5 kind of key relationships in your life, that is predictive of poor health outcomes. And by the way, it seemed to had to be friendships. So kinship, which is relationships around family, can be destructive as well, as we all know. They can obviously be completely constructive, but it was those friendships outside of your family that made a difference. So this is my last one. So changing your thinking. So this is fascinating. So what about your attitude? What if you're just sort of optimistic or the reverse, cynical? And by optimistic, I mean, they're not overly cheerful. It's just that their automatic response is that they know they'll have to endure the odd rainstorm to have a rainbow. They have a confidence about the future, and they see people as inherently good, and things will work out for the best. So these people are not, if the person's 1 second not going at the green light, they aren't hammering on the horn. They're just a little bit more zen. And this guy in the corner is Martin Seligman, and he's written a book on actually learning optimism. And people think you're born with these things, but you can actually learn it. And so this is Hillary Tyndall's study looking at women. There has been studies done in men as well, but the Women's Health Initiative, over 90,000 women before they had heart disease or cancer. And if you scored in the top 25% of optimism, you had a 9% lower chance of developing heart disease and a 14% less chance of dying of any disease. The worst was when you were the opposite, so a cynical hostile. And when you were cynical hostile, you had 23% increase risk of death and a 16% increase in the total mortality. I'm just going to skip this slide, but the same's true about your thinking. So this is a trial done with patients who learned how to do cognitive behavioral therapy and reframe their thoughts, had heart attacks, had a catheterization or some other big cardiac procedure, randomized to normal care versus just changing their thinking. And the person that had done that had 41% less heart attacks, 28% less death by just changing their thinking. We're not talking about a pill or a diet or an exercise program. Like, to me, that's incredible. So one way to think about this is when we think about our lives, 10% is what happens to us and 90% is how we react. And I do buy that. So in the end, can you limit your sitting and sleeping to just 23 and a half hours? Can you think about your daily week and kind of redesign your habits, look for low-hanging fruit? Can you connect in a more meaningful way with people in your life? And can you change your thinking? Can you be more mindful? Can you be more optimistic? Can you have that auto-response? And that's it. Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. Mike, I love that illustrated video, and I'm hoping to be in touch with you after the conference, because I think this would be a very good vehicle for bursts of information on, dare I say, television. I know television hasn't done very well here this morning, and some of you may know I work in television, but I'm very impressed by these animations, and I read somewhere that you may be doing more, or have you already done more?
Yeah, so we've done quite a few more. We've done about 7 or 8. We've done ones on stress, concussions for kids. We have one came out last week around the HPV, which is a vaccine for cancer. We're doing hip and knee replacement coming up, and so there's...
Do these belong to the clinic? Are the rights to these animations in your hand or in the filmmakers'
No,
hand?
they're in my hands, and so the hospital finds it hard to sign a deal with YouTube. So they're in our hands, and so yeah, that's our goal. Is I think you're totally right, and I think we need to embed more of this positive messaging. I think when we look a lot of our health, it's because stuff has been marketed to us that hasn't been good for our health, and it's time to reverse that tide.
Well, we'll be in touch, and I hope we can do a deal.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Dr.